Hello, my unfortunate listener, and welcome to the cult of the Virtuoso. Just kidding. The cult of the Virtuoso can't be that bad, right? Now let's ensure a shared vocabulary before we begin. A virtuoso is one who excels in the technique of an art. You might have thought it was specifically music. I thought that as well. It's a relatively new term in the music field, with its original definition dating back to 1703, and virtuoso, as we know it today, referring to musicians since around the early 20th century, though our guys that we're talking about today were a little before that. Franz Liszt was not one of the first virtuoso to hit the stages, but he had one of the strongest impacts on audiences in the history of Western classical music. He was primarily known throughout his audiences for his gigantic stage presence, for his excessively technical pieces, particularly in front of orchestras, and for his musical drama, which stemmed from him adding more challenge to passages at time to enthrall the audiences more and more. This was seen especially in his performance of Concertstück, one of his war horses. In the context of virtuosi, war horses are pieces which showcase technical and lyrical skills of the performer. He programmed this piece particularly often, almost in every concert in Paris. He took the piece's already virtuosic material and dramatized it even more, creating a sense of the imaginary protagonist in the performer's melodic voice. The public started to see this piece as a drama, with the pianist playing an army general, leading the orchestra forward to victory, or alternatively defeating them, in the same way that a hero would defeat their horse by crushing its spirit before riding it into battle. Now, timeline-wise, Liszt was active during the aftermath of the French Revolution, which we talked about briefly in class. There was a total power vacuum in the entirety of Europe, since they did something to the aristocrats. I don't remember what, but... Oh yeah! Now, people projected a militaristic persona onto him, like this warhorse. You like it? Particularly based on his music, but also especially based on sources outside of the notes in the page. They imagined him as the protagonist at each and every one of his concerts due to these factors. He was placed in front of the orchestra and took a great leadership role. And because of the power vacuum going on in Greater Europe and with the pre-existing literal cult of the Napoleon, they started projecting Liszt onto Napoleon and Napoleon onto Liszt. Specifically, romanticizing the young soldier, General Bonaparte, before he crowned himself emperor. All the good parts of Napoleon, none of the bad stuff. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too or something. They also tried to explain part of this craze with physiognomy. People's traits can be understood from their facial structure, which is not a real science. But their faces do look similar. So they must have very similar morals, right? Right? Now, Liszt understood the militaristic tendencies of Concertstück. When writing, Karl Maria von Weber wanted to increase popularity, and so he put a through thread, a story, about a knight returning to his noble bride victorious just before her despair. He broke apart the traditional form of the concerto in favor of this increased drama. Originally, he had written this concerto for piano, and thought that a minor concerto would be too boring, and so this was the best way for him to drum up some popularity. The third movement's march allowed especially for a militaristic feel in this piece. And on top of this already dramatized piece, Liszt enriched entrances in his cadenza with more strength. He made simple passages more technical and added lots of ornaments. He took something that was already largely dramatic and upped the drama as much as possible. His cadenza, particularly, broke from the narrative continuity of this programmatic piece, allowing him to break from the story and see the soloist as a literal protagonist as opposed to a musical one. In terms of a protagonistic standpoint, in public perception, any successful protagonist needed an antagonist, and so Liszt's rivalry with Sigismund Thalberg allowed the public to choose a side and root for their favorite. But based on the history we've inherited, we all know who won. Let's talk about Niccolo Paganini. What we know about him are the legends around him selling his soul to the devil, because he was so talented in the violin, which means he must have made a deal with the devil. Another rumor that I found out about through this project is that he was so skilled with the G string, apparently he was imprisoned for murder, and he was only allowed to bring one string of his violin in, so he wouldn't hang himself. Now, the explanation for both of these is more boring. He practiced to get where he was, and he initially played a piece that he wrote on two strings as a lover's duet in a secret serenade at the court of Napoleon's sister, Eliza Bonaparte. And when she heard this duet, she asked him to play on only one string, and so his mastery of the G string was born. On stage, similar to the public asserting a certain character around Liszt, Paganini's audience saw his somber, hellish visage, his long arms, his pale face, his daunting expression, and wondered if he was actually close to death or perhaps faking it. Either way, because of his skill and appearance, the audience grafted Paganini, the devil's violinist, onto Paganini the man, which is how we know him today. Through both Liszt and Paganini, we've noticed a few connections. I'll call them virtuoso prereqs. Firstly, start your career in a time of great political turmoil. So now's your chance. You need a public character, what the public thinks of you, and you need public favor, which is gotten through painting oneself as the imaginary protagonist, by emerging victorious from battles, both in musical drama and in your musical rivalries. So, time to get murdering. Alright, let's become famous virtuosos. And remember, if you can't take the heat, you probably picked up the devil's violin by mistake.